What happens when an entire town becomes convinced that their reflections are killing them? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases of collective hysteria in American history. But before we descend into the shattered glass and paranoia of a Colorado mining town that destroyed itself from the inside out, I need you to ask yourself something. What would it take for you to fear your own face? To avoid every reflective surface? To smash every mirror in your home? Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you believe mass hysteria can actually kill, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about the power of belief, the fragility of sanity, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the mind can be deadlier than any weapon. Reflection Peak is a fictionalized location. The events described are crafted narratives inspired by historical cases of mass hysteria, mining town tragedies, and folklore surrounding mirrors and reflections. Any resemblance to specific real persons or events is coincidental. In the archives of Gilpin County, Colorado, there exists a resolution from the Town Council of Reflection Peak, dated March 17, 1908. The ordinance is brief, clinical, bureaucratic, except for one detail that shouldn't exist. It mandates the immediate destruction of all mirrors, polished metal surfaces, still water vessels, and any object capable of producing a clear human reflection within town limits. Violation carried a fine of $50 more than a month's wages for a miner. But here's what makes this document truly disturbing. It passed unanimously. Every single council member voted yes. And within 72 hours, every mirror in Reflection Peak had been systematically destroyed. We're about to delve into a mystery that claimed 3 lives in 6 weeks, where a prosperous mining community descended into madness so complete that they literally couldn't bear to look at themselves, leaving behind a ghost town and a legacy of broken glass that still crunches beneath the feet of hikers who venture into those abandoned streets. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a question about the terrifying power of collective belief, and whether, under the right circumstances, a town can literally think itself to death. It was the year 1907. The Wright brothers were refining their flying machine. Oklahoma had just become the 46th state, and America was in the midst of a copper boom that was transforming the Rocky Mountains into a landscape of industrial ambition. But in the remote peaks of central Colorado, prosperity was about to transform into something far more sinister, a descent into darkness that would prove that sometimes the reflection in the mirror is the least of what we should fear about ourselves. Reflection Peak wasn't supposed to be a town at all. The maps from 1879 show nothing but wilderness there, a narrow valley carved between 2 granite peaks that rose like ancient sentinels guarding secrets the earth had kept for millennia. The Ute people who traveled through these mountains had a name for the valley, though it wasn't recorded by white settlers until much later, and by then the irony would be almost unbearable. They called it Nilchibia, roughly translated as the place where wind shows you yourself, a strange name for a valley. But the Ute knew something the miners who would come later had forgotten, that some places have qualities that go deeper than geology, older than memory. The copper was discovered in 1882 by a prospector named Jonathan Milbrook, a man whose diary would later become one of the most disturbing documents in Colorado historical archives. His first entry about the valley is dated June 3, 1882, and it's remarkably mundane. Rich copper deposits confirmed. Assay shows 80% pure. Will file claim immediately. But there's a second entry from the same day, written later that night, and the handwriting is different, shakier, more urgent. Strangest thing at dusk. The creek runs still in certain spots, still as glass, saw my face looking back at me, but could swear, absolutely swear it moved before I did, just a fraction, just a moment. Trick of the light, surely. The altitude here makes a man imagine things. Within 3 years, Reflection Peak had grown to a population of 470, 3 souls. The Millbrook Mining Company had sunk 3 major shafts into the mountainside, and copper ore was flowing out at a rate that made men rich and drew workers from as far as Pennsylvania and Wales. The town sprouted quickly, the way mining camps did in those days. A main street of mud and optimism, flanking buildings constructed from raw timber that still wept sap in the summer heat. But Reflection Peak was different from other mining towns in one crucial way. It was built on water. The valley sat atop an underground aquifer that surfaced in dozens of springs, creating pools and streams that crisscrossed the town like veins. The main street itself had to be built on wooden platforms because the ground was perpetually wet, perpetually seeping. Everywhere you looked in Reflection Peak, there was water, still water, clear water, water that reflected. The residents thought this was a blessing. Fresh water meant they didn't have to haul it up from the lowlands. It meant their gardens grew impossibly lush at 8,000 feet elevation. It meant the town had a quality other mining camps lacked, a kind of verdant beauty that made wives more willing to endure the isolation, that made men feel they were building something permanent, something civilized. They were wrong about the blessing part. By 1905, Reflection Peak had reached its zenith. The population had swelled to nearly 1,000 residents. The town boasted a proper church with a bell tower, a two-story school, a mercantile, a bank, a doctor's office, a hotel with 23 rooms, and this detail matters, a shop owned by a German immigrant named Klaus Reinhardt, who specialized in mirrors and fine glass. Reinhardt's shop was renowned throughout the territory. He imported beveled mirrors from Europe, crafted custom pieces, and had a technique for silvering glass that produced reflections of unusual clarity and brightness. People traveled from Denver and Colorado Springs to purchase Reinhardt mirrors. They were works of art, ornate frames surrounding glass so perfectly polished that, as one advertisement claimed, you could count every eyelash on your reflected face. Nearly every home in Reflection Peak had at least one Reinhardt mirror. The wealthier families had several. The hotel lobby featured an enormous gilt-framed piece, 6 feet tall, that had taken 8 men to install. The saloon had a full wall of mirrors behind the bar. The church had a modest mirror in the pastor's office. Even the school had a row of small hand mirrors in the girls' washroom. The town, in essence, had become a hall of mirrors. Everywhere you turned, you saw yourself looking back, and that's where the wrongness began. The first death was ruled accidental. Sarah Hendricks, age 28, wife of a mine supervisor, mother of 2 young daughters. On the morning of November 3, 1907, her husband Thomas found her at the bottom of their staircase, her neck broken, her eyes open and staring at the ceiling with an expression that Thomas later described as absolutely terrified, more afraid than any person I'd ever seen, alive or dead. The official conclusion was straightforward. She had fallen down the stairs. It happened, tragic, certainly, but not mysterious. The town mourned, the Hendricks family grieved, and life continued. But there was a detail that didn't make it into the official report. A detail that Thomas Hendricks mentioned to only a few close friends, and only after several drinks had loosened his tongue. When he found Sarah's body, there was a hand mirror on the floor beside her, one of Reinhardt's pieces, ornate silver backing now dented from impact. The mirror itself was shattered into a spiderweb of cracks, but still held together in its frame. And Thomas swore, absolutely swore. that in the seconds before he picked up his wife's body, before shock fully set in, he had glanced at that broken mirror. And in the fractured glass, he had seen his wife's reflection looking back at him, not her body on the floor. Her face, in the mirror, alive and screaming silently, her mouth open in a perfect O of terror. He dismissed it immediately. Shock does things to the mind. Grief creates illusions. Everyone knows this. He never mentioned it to the sheriff, never wrote it down, and tried very hard to never think about it again. But he did mention it to his friend, a miner named Patrick Donnelly. And Patrick, who had been in the Hendricks home many times, asked a question that Thomas couldn't answer. Why was Sarah carrying a hand mirror on the stairs? She had a full-length mirror in her bedroom, another in the hallway. Why would she need to carry one? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from Patrick's pipe, and neither man could find a good answer. 3 weeks later, Patrick Donnelly was dead too. This is where the pattern begins to emerge, lowly at first, like a photograph developing in chemical solution, the image taking shape until you can no longer deny what you're seeing. Patrick Donnelly, age 34, experienced miner, father of one, member of the church choir, found in his home on November 24, 1907. Cause of death: massive trauma to the skull, consistent with falling face, first into a hard surface. The hard surface in question, his bedroom mirror. The scene, according to Sheriff William Tate's report, was disturbing beyond the usual scope of accidental death. Patrick had apparently crashed into the mirror with such force that the glass had shattered completely, and he had continued forward, embedding shards into his face, his throat, his hands, as if he had been trying to push through the mirror itself, trying to reach something on the other side. The impact had been severe enough to crack the plaster wall behind the mirror. Blood spatter suggested he had pulled back once, perhaps trying to extract himself, then plunged forward again. And again, at least 4 separate impacts before he finally collapsed. Patrick's wife, Mary, had been downstairs when it happened. She heard the first crash, then her husband screaming not words, just raw sound, terror vocalized. By the time she reached the bedroom, perhaps 30 seconds later, he was already dead, lying in a spreading pool of blood and broken glass, his face essentially destroyed. But here's what haunted Sheriff Tate, what he wrote in his personal journal but never included in the official report. Mary Donnelly swore her husband had been talking to the mirror before the crashes began. She couldn't hear the words from downstairs, but she heard his voice, low, urgent, pleading. And she heard another voice responding, a woman's voice, in their bedroom, where only Patrick should have been. When she burst into the room, there was no one else there. Just her husband, dying in the glass, and every mirror shard that still held together reflected nothing but empty room and horror. The town was beginning to notice. 2 deaths in 3 weeks, both involving mirrors. Coincidence, surely. Bad luck. Terrible, tragic bad luck. But Sheriff Tate was a methodical man, and he began to keep a list. He didn't have to wait long to add to it. December brought early snow to the high country, the kind of snow that falls silent and thick, muffling sound, creating a world wrapped in white isolation. Reflection Peak was cut off from the outside world until spring, standard for that altitude, nothing unusual. The residents had supplies, the mine was still operating, and life continued its rhythm. But the rhythm was beginning to falter. On December 7, 1907, Klaus Reinhardt, the mirror maker himself, became the 3rd victim. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Reinhardt was found in his shop, surrounded by his creations, lying beneath the large workshop mirror he used to inspect his pieces for flaws. The mirror had somehow come free from its mounting heavy oak and iron brackets, that should have held 1,000 pounds, and fallen directly onto him. The impact had killed him instantly, crushing his chest, but the position of his body suggested something that made even the most skeptical residents uncomfortable. He was lying on his back, arms extended upward, hands pressed against the underside of the mirror, as if he had been trying to hold it up, or as if he had been trying to push something back through it. His eyes were open, staring up at his own crushed reflection in the unbroken glass, and his mouth was frozen in what witnesses described as not a scream, but a word, one syllable, cut off halfway through. His apprentice, a young man named Thomas Burke, had been in the back room when it happened. He heard Reinhardt talking to himself, or so he thought. The old man often muttered while working, but then the talking became arguing, then shouting, then Reinhardt's voice rose to a scream, "You can't, you're not real, you're not." And then the sound of massive impact, of glass and wood and meat all colliding at once, and then silence. When Thomas reached the workshop, he saw his employer dead beneath the mirror. And he saw something else, something he would swear to until his own death 5 years later from influenza. In the perfect, unbroken surface of the mirror that had killed Reinhardt, there was a crack spreading slowly across the glass, forming the distinct shape of a handprint, fingers splayed, palm pressed flat, appearing from the inside out, as if someone trapped in the reflection was pressing against the glass from within. The crack faded as he watched, disappearing completely within seconds. By the time he summoned help, the mirror was perfect again, unmarked except for the blood. That night, Sheriff Tate called an emergency town meeting. The church was packed on December 8th. 960, 3 residents crammed into a building meant for 400, the air thick with breath and fear, and the smell of wet wool from snow, dampened coats. Every pew was full, the aisles were standing room only, and people pressed against the walls, creating a mass of humanity that seemed to pulse with collective anxiety. Sheriff Tate stood at the pulpit. Pastor Richards had yielded the space without argument, and faced the town he was supposed to protect. He was a practical man, a former cavalry officer, someone who believed in evidence and reason and the law. But he was also honest enough to admit when something felt wrong, and this felt very wrong indeed. 3 deaths in 5 weeks. He began, his voice carrying through the unusual silence. 3 accidental deaths, all involving mirrors. I'm not here to speculate about causes. I'm here to recommend precautions until we understand what's happening. It's not the mirrors. Someone shouted from the back. It's operator error, carelessness. Sarah Hendricks wasn't careless. A woman's voice countered. She was the most careful person I knew. She wouldn't fall downstairs. Patrick Donnelly was drunk. Someone else offered. I saw him at the saloon that afternoon. He had 2 beers. Mary Donnelly's voice cut through the crowd, sharp with grief and anger. 2 beers across 4 hours. He wasn't drunk, and he wasn't clumsy. Something happened in that room, something he saw in that mirror. The crowd began to fragment into arguments, theories, accusations. Tate held up his hand for silence and surprisingly got it. "Here's what I'm proposing," he said. "We cover all large mirrors in town. We remove mirrors from public spaces. We're careful, just until we... This is superstitious nonsense." The speaker was Dr. Albert Mosby, the town physician, a man of science who had no patience for what he saw as medieval thinking. 3 accidents do not make a pattern. People die, sometimes in strange ways. This is life. We cannot run our town based on fear and coincidence. It's not coincidence when all 3 deaths involve mirrors. Tate insisted. Then it's a design flaw in Reinhardt's products. We'll bring in an inspector from Denver in the spring, have every mirror examined for structural issues, but we will not, absolutely not, give in to panic and destroy property based on ghost stories. The debate raged for 2 hours. In the end, a compromise was reached. Mirrors in public spaces would be covered with cloth. Residents were advised to use caution around mirrors in their homes. Anyone who wanted to remove their mirrors could do so, but there would be no mandate. It was reasonable, it was measured, it was completely inadequate. Because that night, as the townspeople walked home through fresh snow, as they lit their lamps and prepared for bed, as they caught glimpses of themselves in the glass, they passed bathroom mirrors, bedroom mirrors, decorative mirrors in hallways. Something was already spreading through reflection peak like a contagion. Not a disease, something worse, an idea. What if your reflection isn't you? What if it's something else wearing your face, waiting behind the glass? What if every time you look in a mirror, something looks back that's almost you but not quite? And what if, after years of being trapped, watching you live the life it can never have, it's found a way through? That night, 5 people in Reflection Peak reported the same experience. They had looked in their mirrors and seen their reflections move independently. Just for a moment, just a fraction of a second too slow or too fast, just enough to notice, just enough to doubt. And doubt, in a town like Reflection Peak, was the deadliest contagion of all. The 4th death came on December 11th. Margaret Crawford, age 45, schoolteacher, widow, known for her stern manner and her exacting standards. She lived alone in a small house on the eastern edge of town, a house she kept meticulously clean, everything in its proper place. She was found by her colleague, Miss Sarah Brennan, who had come to check on her when Margaret failed to arrive at school that morning. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was in perfect order, except for the bathroom, which looked like a storm had passed through it. Every mirror in Margaret's house had been covered with sheets, tablecloths, towels, anything she could find. Except one, the large bathroom mirror, which was shattered into thousands of pieces across the floor, in the sink, embedded in the walls. And Margaret herself was in the bathtub, fully clothed, the water long since turned cold, her wrists slashed with a shard of mirror glass that she still clutched in her right hand. The water in the tub was crystal clear strange, given the wounds, until the sheriff realized that Margaret had been sitting there for hours, bleeding slowly, the water overflowing and draining at the same rate, washing the blood away as it fell, keeping everything clean. Even in death, Margaret Crawford maintained her standards. But it was what Miss Brennan found on the bathroom counter that truly disturbed Sheriff Tate. A note, written in Margaret's precise hand, dated that morning. "I cannot stand it any longer. She is in every reflection. She watches me constantly. She whispers things I cannot unhear. She knows my secrets, my shames, my hidden thoughts, because she is me. Me I refuse to be, the me I've buried beneath respectability and duty and denial. She says if I will not let her out, then I must come in. I choose to neither. I choose to end this. God forgive me. But I cannot bear to see my own face another moment. She has ruined even that for me." That night, Sheriff Tate went home to his wife Eleanor and made a decision that likely saved both their lives. He covered every mirror in their house with thick canvas, nailing it directly into the walls. When Eleanor protested she was a vain woman, she needed her mirrors, he told her about Margaret's note. He told her about the pattern he was seeing, the escalation, the way the deaths were becoming less accidental and more purposeful. Eleanor stopped protesting. She helped him with the nails. By December 15th, 40% of the households in Reflection Peak had covered their mirrors. By December 20th, it was closer to 70%. The town had fractured into two camps. those who believed something was genuinely wrong with the mirrors, and those who insisted this was mass hysteria, superstition, weakness of mind. Dr. Mosby led the skeptics. He gave a presentation at the town hall on December 18th about the phenomenon of mass hysteria, citing historical examples: the Salem witch trials, the dancing plague of 1518, the New England vampire panic. We are rational people living in a rational age. He insisted, "We will not succumb to medieval superstition. These deaths are tragic but explainable. We must hold firm to reason." His wife Agnes sat in the front row, nodding along with every word, the model of support. But those who looked closely might have noticed that she never once looked at the decorative mirrors hanging on the town hall walls. She kept her eyes down or straight ahead, very carefully avoiding her own reflection. On December 21st, the winter solstice, Agnes Mosby became the fifth victim. She did it in their bedroom while her husband was at the office, treating a miner for a broken arm. The method was almost identical to Patrick Donnelly's death. She had run at the full-length mirror in their bedroom with such force that the impact shattered both the glass and her skull. But unlike Patrick, who had done it in apparent panic or confusion, Agnes had been methodical. The room showed evidence of multiple attempts. She had backed up to the far wall share, if Tate could see the marks where her heels had scraped the floorboards, and charged. The first impact had merely cracked the mirror, so she backed up and tried again, and again, at least 6 times before the final, fatal blow. But here's the detail that made even the skeptics pause. Between each attempt, she had rearranged herself. Her hair, her dress, as if she were preparing to meet someone, as if she were making herself presentable for the thing in the mirror. Dr. Mosby found her himself when he came home for lunch. The neighbors heard his scream, a sound that carried across the snow, a sound of absolute denial of a world, you collapsing. And by the time they arrived, the doctor was sitting on the floor beside his wife's body, covered in her blood, holding a shard of the broken mirror and staring at it with the intensity of a man searching for answers in the glass. She wouldn't, he kept saying, she wouldn't. Agnes was rational, she was strong, she wouldn't believe, she couldn't, but she had. And that was the moment the dam broke in Reflection Peak. By nightfall, a mob had formed at Klaus Reinhardt's shop. His apprentice, Thomas Burke, had wisely fled to Denver weeks earlier, but the shop still stood, full of mirrors, dozens of them in various stages of completion. The mob, there's no other word for it, broke down the door and began systematically destroying everything inside. Sheriff Tate tried to stop them. He stood in front of the shop and pleaded for order, for law, for sanity. But the crowd had gone beyond his authority. They had seen too much, feared too much, lost too much. And when a man named Joseph Hartley pushed past the sheriff and brought a sledgehammer down on the first mirror, the sound of shattering glass was like a signal, a release, a collective exhalation of terror that had been building for 2 months. They destroyed every mirror in the shop that night. Every piece of polished glass, every half-finished commission, every mirror waiting to be installed in some unsuspecting home. They piled the wreckage in the street, and in a detail that would later seem almost pagan, burned the wooden frames in a massive bonfire while the glass was buried in a pit dug at the edge of town. Dr. Mosby watched from his doorway, his wife's blood still on his hands, and said nothing. His silence was his surrender. Reason had lost this battle. The town council met in emergency session on December 23, 1907. 7 men around a table, their reflections carefully avoided by covering the polished wood surface with a tablecloth. Outside, snow was falling again, thick and constant, and Reflection Peak was entombed in white silence. "We need to address this systematically," said James Rutherford, the bank president. 5 deaths in 7 weeks. The pattern is undeniable. Every death has involved mirrors in some capacity. Every death has involved a person with access to mirrors, countered Henry Walsh, the mine supervisor, still clinging to rationality even as it slipped through his fingers. "That's not a pattern. That's a universal condition. We all have mirrors. Had mirrors," corrected Thomas Hendricks quietly. Sarah's widower had aged a decade in 2 months, his face gaunt, his eyes perpetually shadowed. "Most of us have destroyed them or covered them, but not all. Some people are still using them. Because some of us refuse to surrender to superstition." Walsh's voice rose, desperate. "This is a town of educated people. We have a school, a church, industry. We cannot make policy based on hysteria. Then explain my wife's note, doctor." Mosby's voice cut through the argument like a scalpel. He had aged too, this man of science, the certainty drained from him and replaced with something hollow. "Explain what she saw that drove her to destroy herself against a mirror. Explain it scientifically, Henry. Please, I would very much like a scientific explanation." Walsh had no answer. Pastor Richards, who had been silent until now, spoke carefully. "Regardless of the cause, natural, supernatural, psychological, the effect is real. People are dying, and there's a common element. We have a responsibility to protect this community." "What are you proposing?" Rutherford asked. The pastor took a breath. "I'm proposing we ban mirrors within town limits. All mirrors. All reflective surfaces that can show a clear human image. We pass an ordinance. We give people 3 days to comply, and then we systematically eliminate every mirror in reflection peak." "That's insane," Walsh said, but his protest sounded tired, wrote. "Is it more insane than 6 more deaths?" Richards shot back. "Then 12. How many people have to die before we act?" The vote was called. It was unanimous. Even Walsh, in the end, raised his hand. The ordinance would be drafted that night and announced the next morning, Christmas Eve. Every resident would have 72 hours to destroy or surrender all mirrors in their possession. But as the council members filed out into the snow, each one carefully avoiding the windows that might show their reflections in the darkness beyond, none of them could shake the feeling that they were already too late, that something had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped by ordinances or votes or desperate attempts at control. That night, 2 more people died. The Brannigan twins, Constance and Catherine, age 17. Beautiful girls, identical, inseparable since birth. They were found by their mother on Christmas Eve morning, in their shared bedroom, lying side by side on the floor between their twin beds. They had apparently stood facing each other in the darkness. Their positions suggested they had been holding hands, and simultaneously cut their own throats with shards of the hand mirrors they each owned. The cuts were precise, almost surgical, as if they had practiced, as if they had been very careful to do it exactly right, exactly the same, together. Their mother's screams brought half the town running through the Christmas Eve snow. When Sheriff Tate arrived, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the wall between the girls' beds, someone had used blood to write a single sentence in handwriting that matched neither twins' usual hand. Now we know which one was the reflection. The message made no sense. Made perfect sense. Made too much sense in a way that refused logical analysis. The twins had been identical, yes, but separate people. Different souls, different lives, except, what if they hadn't been? What if one had been real and the other had been a reflection made flesh somehow, made real through some crack in the world that reflection peak had been built upon? What if the mirrors were showing people the truth they couldn't bear to see? By noon on Christmas Eve, the exodus had begun. There was no formal announcement, no organized evacuation. It happened organically, like a flock of birds taking flight at some signal invisible to human eyes. Families began loading wagons, packing what they could carry, preparing to leave despite the snow, despite the winter roads, despite the fact that the mountain passes were likely impassable. They would take their chances with the weather over staying another night in Reflection Peak. The Hendricks family left first, Thomas and his 2 daughters, carrying only clothes and food and the family Bible. No mirrors, nothing reflective, not even the silver candlesticks that had been his grandmother's. "We're leaving it all," he told Sheriff Tate. "We're leaving this cursed place, and we're never coming back." The Brennan family followed, then the O'Connells. The Zimmermans, the Chens who ran the mercantile, the Kowalskis who worked the mine. Family after family, wagon after wagon, forming a slow procession down the mountain through the snow, choosing the deadly risk of winter travel over the certainty that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the town they had built. By nightfall on Christmas Eve, 3 families had departed. The town's population had been cut in half. Those who remained, and there were still hundreds, fell into roughly 3 categories. First, the stubborn rationalists who refused to believe, who insisted this was mass hysteria and that abandoning a profitable mining town over a few coincidental deaths was lunacy. Henry Walsh led this faction, and they barricaded themselves in their homes, mirrors covered or destroyed as per ordinance, but determined to wait out what they saw as temporary madness. Second, the trapped, those too poor to leave, or too old, or too sick, or who simply had nowhere else to go. Reflection Peak was their home, their livelihood, their entire world. Where would they go? How would they survive? They stayed because they had no choice, and they prayed that the ordinance would be enough, that eliminating the mirrors would eliminate the deaths. And third, there were those who stayed because they couldn't leave, not physically trapped, but psychologically. People who had seen something in the mirrors before covering them, something that wouldn't let go of their minds. People who were convinced that their reflections were still out there somewhere, waiting, and that running wouldn't help because you can't outrun something that looks exactly like you, that knows every thought you've ever had, that is you in every way except the one that matters most. Dr. Mosby was in this category. He sat in his house with Agnes's body still in the bedroom upstairs. The ground was too frozen to dig a grave, and he couldn't seem to leave. Sheriff Tate begged him to go, offered to help him pack, but the doctor just shook his head. "Where would I go?" he asked. "I'll see her everywhere anyway, in every reflective surface, every window, every puddle. She'll be there because she's in here." He tapped his temple. The mirrors didn't create this. They just showed us what was always there. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright over a town that had become a graveyard of the living. The systematic destruction of mirrors began on December 26, 1907. Sheriff Tate organized teams to go house to house, collecting and destroying any remaining mirrors under the authority of the emergency ordinance. They worked methodically, room by room, building by building. Every mirror was removed, wrapped in cloth to prevent anyone from accidentally glimpsing their reflection, then carried to the pit at the edge of town where Reinhardt's mirrors had been buried. The pit was growing deeper, filling with shattered glass that glinted in the winter sun like fractured diamonds, like broken promises, like the remnants of a collective vanity that had somehow become fatal. The teams worked in silence, mostly. There was an unspoken agreement not to look at the mirrors as they removed them, not even to verify what they were. Trust that it was a mirror, cover it, remove it, destroy it, don't look, but of course some people looked. On December 28th, a man named Robert Finch, part of the mirror collection team, made the mistake of glancing at a large hall mirror as he and his partner lifted it off the wall of the hotel. Just a glimpse, just a second, but that was enough. He dropped his end of the mirror. His partner, startled, dropped the other end, and the mirror shattered on the floor. Robert Finch stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces, his face gone absolutely white. "What did you see?" his partner asked. Finch's answer was barely a whisper. "Nothing. I saw nothing where my reflection should have been. Just the room behind me, perfectly clear, but I wasn't in it. Like I was already gone." He left town that afternoon with his family, driving his wagon through snow that was falling again, steady and thick. They made it 12 miles before the wagon overturned on the ice. Robert Finch survived the crash. But that night, in the emergency shelter they found in an abandoned hunting cabin, he walked out into the snowstorm without coat or boots and was found frozen solid the next morning, his eyes open, his face peaceful, as if he had found what he was looking for in the whiteness. Back in Reflection Peak, the mirror destruction continued. By New Year's Day, 1908, the town had been purged of every obvious mirror. But that's when they discovered the true scope of the problem. Mirrors weren't the only reflective surfaces. There was polished metal. There were windows at night when the interior was lit. There were puddles of still water. There were glass bottles. There were polished copper fixtures from the mine. There was the smooth, dark surface of cast iron pans. There were dozens, hundreds of ways to accidentally catch a glimpse of yourself. And people were starting to understand that the ordinance, well, intentioned as it was, couldn't protect them. Not really, because the problem wasn't the mirrors themselves. The mirrors were just the most perfect way to see it, the clearest revelation of what had always been there. But once you knew to look for it, once you had glimpsed that fractional difference between you and the thing wearing your face in the reflection, you could start to see it everywhere. In the corner of your vision as you passed a window, in the dark surface of your morning coffee, in the eyes of people who looked at you, reflecting a version of yourself that didn't quite match what you knew you were. The paranoia was complete now, absolute. People stopped looking at each other directly. Conversations happened with eyes averted, gazes fixed on the ground, on the sky, on anything except another human face that might catch and reflect your image back at you. The mine shut down on January 3rd. The workers refused to descend into the shafts where the walls were lined with water seepage, where every dark pool was a potential reflection. The economy of Reflection Peak collapsed overnight, but nobody cared about money anymore. Money couldn't protect you from seeing yourself. Sheriff Tate's careful documentation began to break down around this time. His reports became shorter, more fragmented, as if he could no longer maintain the pretense of official procedure. An entry from January 6th simply reads, 3 more gone last night. Don't know how, don't want to know. Everyone is waiting for their turn. The town council tried to meet on January 7th to discuss evacuation plans for the remaining residents, but only 2 of the 7 members appeared. James Rutherford, the bank president, sent a note explaining his absence. "I can no longer trust that the man who would attend your meeting is the same man who writes this letter. I am staying in my home until this ends, one way or another." Pastor Richards, one of the 2 who did attend, tried to organize a prayer service for January 10th. He stood in his church on that bitter morning, waiting for his congregation, but only 14 people came. The church that had once held the entire town in joyful worship now echoed with the quiet desperation of a handful of survivors clinging to faith in a world that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more hostile than any of them had imagined. "God is still with us," Pastor Richards told the small gathering. "Even here, even now, this darkness is a test of our faith, of our strength, of our..." he stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had caught the polished brass of the collection plate being passed through the pews, and in that curved, distorted surface, he had seen something that made the words die in his throat. The service ended abruptly. Pastor Richards asked everyone to leave. That night, he drained the baptismal font, all that still, clear water, and filled it with dirt from the churchyard. When questioned, he said simply, "I will not risk another reflection, not here, not in God's house." The final exodus happened on January 14, 1908. It wasn't planned, it wasn't organized, it was pure animal panic. The trigger was the school. Miss Sarah Brennan, who had stayed behind when her family fled because she felt a duty to the remaining children, made a discovery in the schoolhouse that morning. She had arrived early to prepare the day's lessons for the 11 students still attending, and she noticed that the windows seemed wrong somehow. Darker, thicker. She approached one of the windows cautiously and realized with crawling horror that someone had painted the interior surface black during the night. A crude, hasty job, drips of paint still wet, running down like tears. All 9 windows in the schoolroom had been treated the same way. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the message scratched into the paint on the largest window, carved with something sharp, cutting through the black to reveal the glass beneath. "Don't let the children see." Miss Brennan ran from the school screaming. Her screams brought people from their homes, dozens of them, more than had been seen together in weeks. They stood in the street, a ragged assembly of paranoid, sleep-deprived, traumatized survivors, and they looked at each other, really looked, for the first time in days, and saw their collective madness reflected in each other's haunted eyes. "We have to leave." Someone said, "All of us, right now." "The snow." Someone else began, "I don't care about the snow." The speaker was a woman named Helen Morrison, whose husband had died in December. "I don't care if we die in the mountains. At least we'll die as ourselves, not as whatever these things in the mirrors want us to become." The logic was flawed, desperate, but it resonated with something primal in every person present. They were prey animals fleeing a predator they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't even properly understand. And prey animals don't stay in the trap once they know it's there. Within 2 hours, a caravan of 47 wagons was moving down the mountain. Nearly 200 people, abandoning everything they had built, everything they owned, leaving Reflection Peak to whatever haunted it. Sheriff Tate led the caravan. He had finally accepted that there was nothing law enforcement could do about this. No arrest to be made, no crime to solve, no order to restore. His final act as sheriff was to nail a notice to the door of his own office. The notice was found months later by the first investigators from Denver. It reads simply, "Town abandoned, do not enter, do not look at your reflection, trust me." The caravan made it 6 miles before the first wagon broke a wheel on the ice-slicked road. While the men worked to repair it, children played in the snow nearby, as children will, their laughter a strange sound in that silent landscape. The first genuine laughter anyone had heard in weeks. One of the children, a boy of about 8, discovered a frozen pond just off the road. The ice was clear, polished smooth by wind, reflecting the gray sky above like a perfect mirror. The boy, who had grown up in Reflection Peak and had been taught from birth to admire his reflection, to stand straight, to present well, did what came naturally. He leaned over to look at himself. In the ice, his scream brought the adults running. By the time they reached him, he was smashing at the ice with rocks, weeping, his hands bloody from the impacts. "It waved at me," he sobbed. "I didn't wave and it waved at me. It smiled when I was crying. Make it stop, make it stop." They pulled him away from the pond, wrapped him in blankets, and continued down the mountain, moving faster now, desperate to put distance between themselves and Reflection Peak. But the damage was done. The boy, his name was Timothy Walsh, Henry Walsh's youngest son, would never recover. He lived to age 43, but he never again looked at any reflective surface. He walked through life with his eyes downcast, and the few times someone forced him to look at a mirror, he would scream until his throat bled. The caravan reached the lowlands on January 17th, having lost 3 people to the cold and exposure during the descent. But they had survived, they had escaped, or so they thought. The investigation into Reflection Peak didn't begin until late March 1908, after the snow had melted enough for the passes to be navigable. A team of 6 men from the Denver Sheriff's Department, accompanied by a representative from the mining company and a journalist from the Rocky Mountain News, made the journey to see what had become of the prosperous town that had simply vanished from all communication. Their report, filed on April 2, 1908, remains one of the strangest documents in Colorado law enforcement history. The town was intact. Buildings stood undamaged, doors and windows secured, belongings still in place, as if the residents had simply stepped out for an afternoon and intended to return. The mine equipment was operational. The bank vault was locked but apparently untouched. Everything valuable, the copper in the mine, the money in the bank, the goods in the stores had been abandoned. But there wasn't a single mirror anywhere in town, not one. The investigators searched every building, every home, every business. They found mirror frames with the glass removed. They found nails in walls where mirrors had hung. They found the pit at the edge of town, now a massive crater filled with thousands of pounds of shattered glass, glinting in the spring sunshine like a wound in the earth. And they found the bodies, not all of them. Many of the victims had been buried in the small town cemetery before the Exodus. But they found Dr. Mosby in his home, dead in his chair, a bottle of laudanum empty beside him. They found 3 others who had chosen similar ends rather than face another day in Reflection Peak. And they found Pastor Richards in his church, hanging from the bell tower, a note pinned to his chest. I saw myself clearly at last, and I could not bear what I had become. God forgive me, but I choose the darkness of death over the darkness of self-knowledge. May no one else suffer as we have suffered. The journalist, a man named Peter Aldridge, wrote an extensive article about Reflection Peak that was published on April 12, 1908. The article treated the entire episode as a case study in mass hysteria, a textbook example of how fear and isolation could transform rational people into a panicked mob willing to destroy their own livelihoods over superstition. The article was well written, thoroughly researched, and completely missed the point. Because Peter Aldridge, in his investigation, had been careful not to look at himself. He had covered the mirrors in his Denver hotel room. He had avoided his reflection in windows and water. And late at night, in his private journal never intended for publication, he had written a single paragraph that told a very different story. I looked, of course I looked. I'm a journalist. How could I not look? In the remaining shards at the bottom of the pit, in a puddle of snowmelt inside the church, I looked for my reflection, and I saw it. For just a moment, for just a fraction of a second. I saw it move independently. I saw it smile when I was not smiling. I saw it watching me with an intelligence that was mine but also other, familiar but alien, me but not me, and I understood in that instant why an entire town chose to flee rather than face what the mirrors showed them. Because it wasn't a monster in the glass, it was us. The version of ourselves we spend our entire lives pretending doesn't exist. The shadow, the other, the truth behind the performance we call identity. And Reflection Peak, somehow, had made that truth visible, had given it form, had let it watch it, watching it, and neither version could stand the sight of the other. Peter Aldridge never went near a mirror again either. He died in 1936, at age 54, his bathroom in his boarding house famously containing not a single reflective surface. The Reflection Peak Mining Company attempted to reopen the mine in 1909. They brought in new workers, offered premium wages, built new housing. The operation lasted exactly 11 days. On day 4, a miner reported seeing another crew. In the deeper shafts, men who looked exactly like his team, who moved in perfect synchronization with them but were somehow separate, working in the reflections cast by the standing water that pooled in the tunnels. On day 7, the foreman's wife smashed every window in their new house with a hammer, claiming she couldn't stand seeing that woman, watching her from the glass. On day 11, 3 miners descended into the main shaft and never came back up. A rescue team found them hours later, standing in a circle around a pool of crystal clear water, staring down at their reflections, unresponsive. When the rescuers tried to pull them away, the 3 men began screaming incoherent animal screams that echoed through the tunnels until the rescuers were forced to forcibly drag them to the surface. All 3 men were committed to the state asylum in Pueblo. According to records, they never spoke again, but they spent every day staring at blank walls, their eyes tracking something the doctors couldn't see, something that moved across surfaces that showed no reflection. The mine was permanently sealed on June 1, 1909. The town of Reflection Peak was officially decommissioned, removed from maps, its existence erased from all but historical archives. The remaining buildings were left to rot, and within a decade, nature had begun to reclaim the valley. But the story doesn't end there. Stories like this never really end. Over the decades, Reflection Peak became a local legend, a cautionary tale, a story told to frighten children and entertain tourists. The details became confused, exaggerated, transformed into myth. Some said the town had been cursed by native spirits. Others claimed it was built on a mass grave. Still others insisted it was all fabricated, a marketing scheme gone wrong, a collective delusion that had never really happened. But the evidence remained, the county records, the death certificates, the dozens of witness testimonies, the news articles, the abandoned town itself, still standing in that remote valley, still accessible to hikers willing to make the difficult trek. And people do make the trek, despite warnings, despite the stories, despite the fact that every person who has stayed overnight in Reflection Peak since 1909 has reported the same phenomenon, the sensation of being watched from every reflective surface, the glimpse of movement in peripheral vision, the unshakable certainty that something is looking back from the glass, from the water, from the polished metal, something that knows you completely, because it is you, stripped of pretense, exposed in ways that make death seem preferable to recognition. In 1973, a group of college students from Boulder decided to spend a night in Reflection Peak as part of a psychology project on mass hysteria. They brought cameras, recording equipment, sleeping bags. 5 students went in, 3 came out. The 2 who remained were found 3 days later by a search and rescue team. They were alive but catatonic, sitting in what had been the town square, positioned facing each other like mirror images, their hands raised as if pressing against glass that wasn't there, their eyes wide and fixed on each other's faces with an intensity that the rescuers described as not quite human. One of the survivors eventually recovered enough to speak. Her testimony, given to police on October 14, 1973, included this statement: "We thought we saw ourselves in the windows, but that's not what happened. What happened was, our reflections saw us, and they were angry that we were real and they weren't, angry that they were trapped in the glass while we got to live, and for just a moment, just a terrible moment, the glass became thin, thin enough to touch, and they touched us. And when something that is you but isn't you touches you, you understand that identity is just a story we tell ourselves. And once you know that story isn't real, once you feel the otherness of your own reflection, you can never go back to believing you're singular, solid, whole. You're always doubled, always watched, always one slip away from becoming the reflection instead of the real thing. The town of Reflection Peak was fenced off in 1970. 4. Dangerous structures, no trespassing, signs were posted. But fences don't keep out the truly curious or the truly foolish. And the signs don't mention the real danger. They just warn about unstable buildings and contaminated mine shafts. They don't warn about the mirrors, because there aren't any mirrors in Reflection Peak anymore. Haven't been for over a century. But according to everyone who's been there, you don't need mirrors to see your reflection in that valley. The place itself has become reflective. The air, the shadows, the silence, everything in Reflection Peak shows you back to yourself, whether you want to see or not. So, what really happened in Reflection Peak? Was it mass hysteria, as the official reports concluded? A collective psychological break triggered by isolation, tragedy, and the human tendency toward pattern recognition in random events? Or was there something genuinely anomalous about that valley, about the mirrors Klaus Reinhardt created there, about the intersection of place and object and human consciousness that created conditions for something impossible to become real? The rational answer is obvious. Mass hysteria, grief. Trauma, the power of suggestion. 3 deaths over 10 weeks. Tragic, certainly, but explainable through natural causes, accidents, and suicides influenced by collective fear. The mirror destruction was the symptom, not the cure. The flight from town was panic, not wisdom. But here's what the rational explanation doesn't address. Why do people still see things in Reflection Peak? Why do cameras malfunction there? Why does every pool of water in that valley reflect things that aren't there, or fail to reflect things that are? Why do hikers report the sensation of doubling, of seeing themselves from outside themselves, of losing track of which perspective is real? And here's the question that haunts me as I've researched this story, the question I keep asking myself in the dead of night when I catch my own reflection unexpectedly and see, for just a fraction of a second, something that doesn't quite match my movements. What if the people of Reflection Peak weren't crazy? What if they saw something true that the rest of us are simply too comfortable to acknowledge? What if we're all living with our reflections, our shadow selves, our others, and the only thing that keeps them safely in the glass is our collective agreement not to look too closely, not to question too deeply, not to acknowledge the subtle wrongness that exists between the self we think we are and the self that looks back from the mirror? What if Reflection Peak's only crime was honesty? What if those mirrors simply revealed what all mirrors show, but we choose not to see? The story of Reflection Peak reminds us that we are mysteries even to ourselves, that identity is more fragile than we like to admit, that the line between self and other, between observer and observed, between the one who looks and the one who is seen, is not as solid as we need it to be for sanity's sake. We spend our lives performing ourselves, curating our image, controlling how we're perceived. We check mirrors to make sure we match the story we're telling about who we are. But what if the mirror knows better? What if the reflection is more honest than we are? What if what we see in the glass is not a copy, but the original, and we're the ones who are pretending? These are dangerous questions, the kind of questions that destroyed an entire town, the kind of questions that drove rational people to smash every mirror they owned and flee into a killing winter, rather than spend another day looking at themselves. But they're also important questions, because if we can't face our own reflections literally or metaphorically, then what are we running from? And more importantly, where do we think we can run to when the thing we're fleeing is ourselves? To this day, there are no mirrors in the valley where Reflection Peak once stood. Oh, hikers bring them sometimes compacts, signal mirrors, recording devices with reflective lenses. But they don't last. Glass shatters spontaneously in that valley. Metal loses its polish. Water becomes cloudy. As if the place itself rejects reflection now, having learned what reflection can reveal. The last documented structure standing in Reflection Peak is the church. The bell still hangs in the tower, and on still nights, hikers report hearing it ring, though there's no wind to move it, no hand to pull the rope. The sound carries across the valley, echoes off the peaks, and fades into silence that feels less like absence and more like waiting. In the church, someone carved a message into the wall beside the empty baptismal font. It was discovered in 2003 by a group of paranormal investigators. The handwriting has never been identified. It matches none of the known residents of Reflection Peak. But the words have been photographed, documented, debated. We are still here. We were always here. The mirror didn't create us. It only let you see. And now that you have seen, you can never not see. You will look for us in every reflection. And someday, we will look back. The investigators who found this message abandoned their equipment and left the valley immediately. One of them later said, "It wasn't the words that scared us. It was the fact that they were still wet, fresh, as if someone had just carved them, but we were alone in that valley, completely alone." Were they? If this journey into the shattered glass and fractured minds of Reflection Peak has resonated with you, if you find yourself checking your reflection a little more carefully tonight, if you've caught yourself wondering whether the face in the mirror moved just a fraction too slow or too fast, then you understand what made an entire town destroy everything they owned and flee into the snow. Subscribe to this channel if you're willing to descend into more histories that ask uncomfortable questions about reality, about identity, about the thin places where the world we think we know cracks open to reveal something stranger beneath. Leave a like if this account made you see yourself differently, if it planted a seed of doubt that will never quite go away. And in the comments, I want to know this. Have you ever caught your reflection doing something you didn't do? Even for a moment, even just a fraction of a second, tell me. Because if the people of Reflection Peak were right, if mirrors really do show us something more than simple physics and light, then we all might be living with strangers wearing our faces. Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories aren't about monsters in the darkness. They're about recognizing that the face in the mirror might not be yours at all. And once you've seen that truth, once you've glimpsed the other behind the glass, you can never again look at yourself the same way. The mirrors of Reflection Peak are gone, but what they revealed remains, waiting, watching, looking back at you from every reflective surface, every still pool, every darkened window where the light is just right to catch your face. Don't look too closely, or do, and see what sees you back.